So you want to play Blood Death Knight. Maybe you heard Blood Death Knight is looking incredibly strong for Mythic Plus and Midnight Season 2, or maybe you're just a filthy little meta chaser. Either way, Blood Death Knight is looking like one of the strongest tanks going into the season. It deals a disgusting amount of damage, especially in AoE. You require very little healing because most of your survival is up to you. And that also means that if you die, it's usually not your healer's fault, it's a you problem. Maybe you entered the pool incorrectly, or maybe you had like 3 defensive cooldowns available, pressed none of them, died, and then typed healer what?
Why no heal? Healer what? Man, did you see that pull? What do you mean healer? Healer what? Healer what? Healer? Wait, what the? Healer what? Did you see that pull? Healer what? Healer what? What's wrong, man? Healer what?
So yeah, that's on you, bro. Blood Death Knight may look complicated at first, so if you have no idea what you're doing, this guide is going to help you with everything you need to know. The first thing you need to understand is the 2 resources in the spec. Blood Death Knight has 2 primary resources that you will constantly be watching: runes and runic power. Let's begin with runes. You have 6 of them, and unlike something like holy power or combo points, you do not begin the fight with 0 and then generate them. Instead, you already have all 6. Whenever you use certain abilities, you spend runes. Those depleted runes then regenerate automatically over time. The important thing to understand is only 3 runes can regenerate simultaneously. If you spend 4 runes, the 4th rune cannot begin regenerating immediately because all 3 regeneration slots are already occupied. That 4th rune has to wait until one of the first 3 finishes. And this creates the first rule: do not mindlessly spend every rune just because you have them. You want to keep your runes cycling, but also you need to preserve enough of them in case shit hits the fan. If you sit at all 6 runes for a long time, none of them are regenerating, so you're wasting potential resource generation. The second resource is Runic Power. As you spend runes and abilities, you generate Runic Power. You then spend that Runic Power primarily on Death Strike. Just like runes, Runic Power has a maximum capacity. If your Runic Power bar is full and you keep spending runes, you're just wasting your time and resources, so you do not want to overcap it. Now that we have a basic understanding of the 2 main resources, we need to talk about your active mitigation. Bone Shield is your active mitigation, and as a tank you want it active whenever enemies are hitting you. While Bone Shield is active, you gain armor, which reduces the physical damage you take. With the improved Bone Shield talent, it also gives you 10% haste and raises your maximum charges from 10 to 12. Enemies consume those charges as they hit you, and Bone Shield can also expire from duration, so you need to watch both the charge count and its timer. Some talents make those even more important. Foul Bulwark increases your maximum health by 1% for each Bone Shield charge you currently have. Ossuary activates while you have at least 5 Bone Shield charges, reducing the cost of Death Strike by 5 and increasing your maximum Runic Power by 10. So the beginner rule is 0 charges is very bad. Less than 5 charges means you lose Ossuary. Once you drop to around like, I don't know, 6-7 charges, you should start thinking about refreshing Bone Shield. You mainly do it with Morrowind. Morrowind costs 2 runes, deals damage in melee, and generates 3 Bone Shield charges. Your second option is Death's Caress. Death's Caress costs 1 rune, can be used from range, applies Blood Plague, and generates 2 Bone Shield charges. That makes Death's Caress excellent when you are entering a pool or when you cannot reach the enemy. But during an actual fight, Morrowind is usually your go-to Bone Shield button because it hits harder and gives 3 charges at once. So when you start a pull with no Bone Shield, you can use Death Caress while running in, then Morrowind once you reach the enemies. That brings you straight to 5 charges, which activates Ossuary and gets your defenses up. Once Bone Shield is handled, your remaining runes can go into dealing damage and building the runic power you need for Death Strike. And that brings us to the main rotational abilities. Blood Death Knight has 6 primary rotational abilities. We've already covered Death's Caress and Morrowind, which are primarily used to generate Bone Shield. That leaves us with Blood Boil, Death and Decay, Heart Strike, and Death Strike. Let's begin with Blood Boil. This is a free AoE ability with 2 charges and a very short cooldown affected by haste. It damages every enemy within 10 yards of you, generates a lot of threat, and applies Blood Plague, which deals shadow damage over time and heals you for a small amount over time. That makes Blood Boil very useful when starting a pool or when new enemies join the fight. The main thing to watch for is a proc called Boiling Point. Heart Strike can empower your next Blood Boil, making it deal 50% more damage and echo 3 seconds later. So generally, press Blood Boil when Boiling Point procs. Use it without the proc if you need Threat, need Blood Plague, or you're about to cap at 2 charges. Hemostasis also makes enemies hit by Blood Boil increase your next Death Strike, but you do not need to overthink it early on. The next ability is Death and Decay. It costs 1 rune and it creates a damaging area on the ground. Its main purpose is activating cleaving strikes. Heart Strike normally hits up to 2 targets, but while you remain inside of Death and Decay, it can hit up to 5. This significantly improves your AoE damage and Runic Power generation. When Death and Decay expires or you leave its area, Cleaving Strikes preserve the bonus for another 4 seconds. Place Death and Decay once all the enemies are gathered and remain inside it whenever possible. Crimson Scourge can reset Death and Decay's cooldown and make your next cast free. These procs comes from attacking the enemies affected by Blood Plague, allowing you to maintain Death and Decay without spending one of your limited runes. Finally, we have Heart Strike. Heart Strike costs 1 rune and it's your default rune spender. It generates Runic Power, hits up to 2 enemies normally, and hits up to 5 while Cleaving Strikes is active. Once Bone Shield is secure, Death and Decay is active, and no important proc requires your attention, you can spend your remaining runes on Heart Strike. But at the end of the day, when it comes to dealing a lot of damage and healing yourself, Death Strike is the answer. It costs 40 Runic Power baseline or 35 with Ossuary active. Death Strike deals a large amount of damage, but that's not its main purpose here, and there's reasons for that. First reason is Death Strike heals you based on the damage you have taken during the last 5 seconds. This is why Blood Death Knight is so self-sufficient. Second reason, it prevents Runic Power from overcapping. If your Runic Power bar is nearly full and you're about to generate more, spend some of it on Death Strike. Any Runic Power generated beyond your maximum is wasted. Third reason is maintaining several important effects connected to Death Strike. The first one of those effects is Blood Shield, which comes from your mastery. Whenever Death Strike heals you, it also creates a shield that absorbs physical damage. The amount absorbed scales with your mastery and the healing performed by Death Strike, and it grows up to 50% of your maximum health. This means Death Strike has value even when you are currently at full HP. Death Strike also interacts with Coagulopathy. With this talent, enemies affected by Blood Plague take an additional 5% damage from you. Death Strike then increases the damage of Blood Plague by 10% for 15 seconds, stacking up to 4 times, which means it can deal an additional 40% damage from this effect. Because Coagulopathy only lasts 15 seconds, you want to use Death Strike often enough to build and maintain those stacks. If the buff is about to expire, that gives you another reason to cast Death Strike, even when your health is full and you're not about to cap Runic Power. Speaking of dying and immediately blaming a healer,
now a word from our sponsor.
Season 2 is the kind of patch where their talents, roots, add-ons, and UI setup can all be slightly outdated, and you might not even realize it. That's where Overgear's coaching can help. It's self-play, so you stay on your own character while an experienced coach reviews your setup, your gameplay, and the specific mistakes that are costing you performance. Basically, instead of assuming why you failed for weeks, someone can point out the problem and say, yeah, it was that. So if you want a coach to look over your character before Season 2 gets fully rolling, check out Overgear using the link in the description. Use code VATS12 for 12% off. This discount is only available for 1 month. Anyway, back to Blood Death Knight. Now that we understand the normal Blood Death Knight rotation, we can add the hero talent tree we will primarily be using for this guide, Sand Lane. Blood Death Knight has 2 hero talent trees to choose from, Sand Lane and Deathbringer. For this guide, we're going to focus primarily on Sand Lane. Deathbringer is still viable and its survivability may be extremely competitive, especially before you get your hands on the 4-tier set bonus. But at the time of testing, Sand Lane is dealing more damage, especially in Mythic Plus, while remaining defensively strong. The main Sane Lane mechanic we need to understand is Vampiric Strike. Whenever you use Death Strike, you have a 35% chance to transform your next Hard Strike into Vampiric Strike temporarily. It still fills the exact same role in your rotation, but it deals additional damage, heals you for 1% of your maximum health, and grants you an effect called Essence of the Blood Queen. Essence of the Blood Queen increases your haste by 1% per stack. It can stack up to 7 times, giving you 7% haste, and it will last for 25 seconds. Using another Vampiric Strike adds a stack and refreshes the duration. Now we need to add the final seasonal mechanic affecting your rotation, the Midnight Season 2 tier set. This tier set is powerful because it rewards normal Blood Death Knight gameplay, using Death Strike often and using Morrowind when Bone Shield needs refreshing. The 2-piece bonus gives you 1 stack of Blood Death whenever you use Death Strike. Each stack gives you 0.5% strength up to 10 stacks. At 10 stacks, your next Morrowind consumes Blood Death and gives you 10% strength for 10 seconds. This is where people can make mistakes. Once Blood Death reaches 10 stacks, Morrowind may start glowing, and when a button glows, the average World of Warcraft player's response is to immediately press it. But don't let the shiny button trick you. At 10 stacks, you're already getting 5% strength. If you instantly Morrowind, you trade that passive bonus for a stronger 10-second window, but then start building Blood Death again from zero. So in most situations, just keep playing normally. Use Morrowind when Bone Shield actually needs refreshing, when you're around 6-7 charges, or when it's about to expire. That way you consume Blood Death naturally, get the 10-second strength buff, and avoid spending 2 runes just because of a glowing button. The 4-piece bonus adds more value to the same moment. When Morrowind consumes Blood Death, it gives you 3 additional Bone Shield charges and deals shadow damage to your target and nearby enemies. That is strong, but it also means pressing it at the wrong time can waste Bone Shield charges. There are exceptions if a boss enters like a damage amp phase or you want a planned burst window. Consuming Blood Death immediately can make sense, but for beginners, I would just press Morrowind when you actually need it. Now we can move into the largest button in the toolkit, Dancing Rune Weapon. Dancing Rune Weapon is your primary offensive and defensive cooldown. The ability normally has a 2-minute cooldown, but with Insatiable Blade, that cooldown is reduced by 30 seconds. When activated, you summon a weapon that fights beside you for 12 seconds. While it is active, you gain 30% additional parry chance. The Insatiable Blade talent also causes it to generate 5 Bone Shield charges when activated. Everlasting Bond improves the cooldown further by summoning 1 additional Dancing Rune Weapon and extending the duration by 4 seconds. Instead of having 1 weapon for 12 seconds, you now have 2 for 16 seconds. The Death Knight Apex talents adds several more effects. For every Dancing Rune Weapon currently active, your damage is increased by 6% and the damage you take is reduced by 6%. With 2 weapons active, that means 12% increased damage done and 12% reduced damage taken. While Dancing Rune Weapon is active, parrying an attack also guarantees that your next hard strike costs no runes and deal 150% additional damage. The Apex talents can also summon shorter duration Dancing Rune Weapons. Whenever you consume a rune, you have a chance to call a Dancing Rune Weapon to assist you for 8 seconds. These shorter rune weapon procs still provide offensive and defensive value, although they're not as powerful or reliable as activating your full cooldown. For Sand Lane, Dancing Rune Weapon becomes even more important. And the reason is Gift of the Sand Lane. While Dancing Rune Weapon is active, every hard strike is guaranteed to become Vampiric Strike. Gift of the Sand Lane also increases the effectiveness of Essence of the Blood Queen by 200% during that window. All of these effects make Dancing Rune Weapon a massive power window. Dancing Rune Weapon is your largest power cooldown, but it's not your only defensive. Next, we're going to cover your defensive cooldowns. Blood Death Knight has several defensive tools, and each one solves a different problem. The first is Vampiric Blood. This has a 90-second cooldown and increases your maximum health by 30, while also increasing all healing and absorbs you receive by 40% for 14 seconds. Improved Vampiric Blood increases that bonus by another 10% and extends the duration by 4 seconds. This makes Vampiric Blood one of your strongest tools for surviving heavy incoming damage because it gives you more health and makes your Death Strikes, Blood Shields, and external healing considerably stronger. Vampiric Blood also interacts with the Red Thirst talent. Every 10 Runic Power you spend reduces its cooldown by 2 seconds. Since Death Strike constantly spends Runic Power, Vampiric Blood comes back much faster than the tooltip says it will. When Vampiric Blood expires, Umbilicus Aeternus gives you an absorbed shield based on the damage your Blood Plague dealt while Vampiric Blood was active. So Vampiric Blood protects you during the dangerous window, and Umbilicus Aeternus continues protecting you afterwards. The next defensive is Icebound Fortitude. Icebound Fortitude has a 2-minute cooldown, reduces all damage you take by 30% for 8 seconds, and it also makes you immune to stuns. Use it proactively before a dangerous hit or when other major defensives are unavailable. Sand Lane also has Bloody Fortitude. This increases Icebound's Fortitude damage reduction by another 20% based on your missing health. The lower your health, the stronger the additional reduction becomes. It also reduces Icebound's Fortitude's cooldown by 3 seconds whenever an enemy dies, which can significantly shorten the cooldown in Mythic Plus. Then we have Anti-Magic Shell. With Anti-Magic Barrier talented, Anti-Magic Shell has a cooldown of around 40 seconds. It absorbs a large amount of magic damage, prevents many harmful magical effects, and generates runic power from the damage absorbed. Use it frequently against dangerous magic damage or debuffs. You also have smaller defensive tools like Death Pact and Lichborn. Death Pact can give you a large emergency heal, but it comes with a healing absorb afterwards, so use it carefully. Lichborn gives you extra survivability but can also help against certain crowd control effects, but it's not one of your main planned defensive cooldowns. Finally, we have Purgatory. Purgatory is your cheat death talent. When you take fatal damage, it prevents you from dying immediately and gives you a healing absorb equal to the damage prevented. You then have 3 seconds to remove that absorb through healing. If the absorb is removed, you survive. If it remains when Purgatory expires, you die. Purgatory can only activate once every 4 minutes, so do not treat it like immortality. It gives you one final opportunity to recover after something has already gone wrong. But defensive sometimes aren't enough. You also need to control the enemies so your party can deal damage safely, and Blood Death Knight has one of the strongest control toolkits available to a tank. Let's begin with Death Grip. Death Grip pulls one enemy directly towards you. Use it to bring range enemies into the pack or stop abilities that can be interrupted by moving the enemy. For larger groups, we have Gorfin's Grasp. This ability pulls enemies towards yourself, an enemy, or even an ally. It is most valuable against group of casters or ranged enemies that will not naturally stack together, and it can also stop abilities vulnerable to displacement. Next, we have Asphyxiate. Asphyxiate is a single target stun. Use it to stop an important cast or temporarily prevent a dangerous enemy from attacking you. Blinding Sleet is your AoE stop. It disorients enemies in front of you and leaves them slowed, making it useful for interrupting several enemies or creating distance when you need to kite. Because it only affects enemies in front of you, make sure you're facing the correct direction before pressing it. Mind Freeze is your normal interrupt. There's no complicated Blood Death Knight rule here, just interrupt dangerous cast as often as possible. And Anti-Magic Zone is your group defensive. It reduces magic damage taken by allies standing inside of it, so use it before the group receives heavy magical damage. For mobility, we have Death's Advance. Death Knights are not especially mobile, so use Death's Advance while gathering enemies or moving through mechanics. With March of Darkness talented, it becomes much more effective for moving between groups during a pull. Chains of Ice applies a powerful slow to one enemy. It is situational, but it can help control an enemy fixating on an ally or prevent something you have gripped away from immediately returning to its target. Dark Command is your taunt, and Raise Ally is your combat resurrection. They do not need complicated explanations. Taunt enemies that should be attacking you, and resurrect an important party member when it can save the pull. You do not need to master every niche interaction before entering your first dungeon, so now let's talk about talents. I'm not going to pretend there is one permanently correct talent build for every Blood Death Knight in every dungeon. Talents change with tuning, they change with the dungeon, they change with the key level, and they can change depending on whether your group needs more damage, survivability, crowd control, or whatever. However, we still need a sensible starting point. For Midnight Season 2, I recommend this build on the screen right now. Most of the throughput talents on the right side of the Blood Death Knight tree are relatively fixed. These are the talents that are supporting the mechanics we've already discussed. The more flexible choices are generally utility talents. For example, you may choose between Gorfin's Grasp and Abomination Limb, depending on how you want to gather enemies. Neither option is universally correct, but I suggest you use the recommended build as a starting point, then look at what successful Blood Death Knights are using in the specific dungeon you're entering. Warcraft Logs allows you to examine players using your spec in that dungeon and around the key level you're attempting. Do not look at only one player, compare several successful runs, look at the talents that remain consistent, then identify the points that change from dungeon to dungeon, and most importantly, ask why. Understanding why a talent is selected is considerably more valuable than copying an import string. It allows you to adjust the build for yourself. With talents handled, the final setup question is which secondary stats we should prioritize. For Satellane and Mythic Plus, my general recommendation is versatility and haste. Versatility is one of your strongest defensive secondary stats because it directly reduces the damage you take. It also increases your damage and healing, so it improves both sides of Blood Death Knight's gameplay. If you're no longer worried about dying and want to focus more heavily on damage, you can prioritize haste and critical strike instead. However, I would not recommend building entirely for damage while you're still learning the spec or progressing into dangerous key levels. But remember that every secondary stat provides some value. Blood Death Knight does not have one useful stat and 3 completely worthless ones. Because of that, item level and total stats matter more. Do not automatically replace substantially higher item level piece because the lower piece happens to contain your 2 preferred secondary stats. In many cases, the higher piece will still be better because it provides more strength, stamina, armor, and total secondary stats. Trinkets are more complicated because their effects and procs can be more valuable than their raw stats. The best trinket can also change with tuning and whatever you need more, defense or damage. Check current simulations, logs, and reliable Blood Death Knight resources once the season begins, rather than relying permanently on a YouTuber's trinket tier list. So that is Blood Death Knight is one of the most self-sufficient tanks in the game, but that self-sufficiency comes with responsibility. Your healer cannot manage your runes for you, they cannot generate runic power for your death strike, and they cannot press your defensive cooldowns before the dangerous damage arrives. Your survival is primarily controlled by you, and as you learn, limit test, experiment with how large you can pull, learn which defensive each pull requires, and see how many times you can use your cooldowns throughout the dungeon. Then start planning those cooldowns around the dangerous pulls instead of pressing everything simultaneously or saving everything forever. If you remember nothing from this guide, remember these priorities. Maintain at least 5 bone shield charges. Do not cap or completely starve on your resources. And press your defensive cooldowns before you die. Once you understand these priorities, the spec stops feeling complicated. You know why you're pressing each button, what resources you are managing, and what mistake caused your death. If this guide helped you understand Blood Death Knight, leave a like and subscribe for more videos just like this one. And as always, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.